Now, when you think about barbecuing, you don't often stop to think about the history behind it. And who would have thought that the history behind grilling had anything to do with the Model T Ford? What now? You've often considered yourself a grill master. You should give some thanks to Henry Ford. When it comes to Henry Ford, most people genuinely associate him with perfecting the assembly line. An avid outdoorsman and also an early environmentalist, Henry Ford found a way to solve two problems at once. The first of which was the fact that his sawmills were producing an exceedingly large amount of waste. And if you know anything about Henry Ford, he genuinely liked to try and find a way to use every scrap he possibly could. Second problem that he had was trying to find a cheap and safely transportable fuel source on his camping trips. Any of you have ever tried to produce a campfire in the middle of nowhere, it is not necessarily something that is, one, easy to do, and two, something that is quick when it comes to preparing food. Henry Ford was having phenomenal success with his Model T Ford, and by the summer of 1919, his company was producing roughly about 1 million cars per year. When reviewing his resources, he realized that each Model T Ford was costing him about 100 board feet of wood per car. It was used in a great majority of making the car, from everything from the steering wheel to the dashboard to even the floors were made out of wood. So around this time was about a year or two after the Dodge brothers had left Ford Motor Company. So in that sort of argument that led to the Dodge brothers leaving Ford Motor Company, Ford realized that he no longer wanted to depend on outside dealers. He wanted to make sure that he controlled his supply chain. So that meant that he no longer wanted to purchase wood from an outside manufacturer. Henry was no longer going to be at the whim of his suppliers and their supply chain. He had to make sure that almost everything at Ford Motor Company was brought in-house. That meant that Henry needed wood, and he needed wood quick. Henry Ford, for some time, had been eyeing a perfect piece of land in the Iron Mountains. But if Ford was going to secure the land for a reasonable price, he needed to make sure that he had a real estate agent he could rely on. The only person that he happened to know that dabbled in real estate at the time was his cousin Minnie's husband, a man by the name of E.G. Kingsford. Now, up until this point, Edward Kingsford's life had been fairly unsubstantial. He had dabbled in real estate, but not really had a whole ton of success in it. And when times got kind of rough, Minnie, Ford's cousin, reached out to Henry, and Henry actually supplied him with a dealership. In the dealership, he was actually doing pretty well, kind of found a new calling in being a franchisee of Ford Motor Company. In the summer of 1919, Henry Ford reached out to Kingsford and asked if he wanted to tag along on one of his camping trips. I realized at the time, more than likely, these were just normal people. But it had to have been a little intimidating for Edward Kingsford to show up to a camping trip where he shared the party with Thomas Edison, Harvey Firestone, and a naturalist and essayist at the time known as John Burroughs. Were all some pretty heavy hitters for their day. Imagine being this low-level Ford dealership owner, somebody who dabbled in real estate, having to spend the weekend with these unbelievably amazing people. It would have been both nerve-wracking and probably one of the coolest weekends I could possibly think of. At some point, Henry Ford pulled Edward over and said, "I'm wondering if you would be interested in helping me try and make a deal." That deal was to purchase approximately 314,000 acres of the Iron Mountains of Michigan. The profit that would have been generated for Edward in this transaction alone would have been substantial enough for him to do, let's just say, a number of improvements to his Ford dealership. That wasn't the only thing that happened when he was on this trip, because at some point, the topic of Ford reducing the amount of waste that he would produce through logging came up, and a conversation was had between Henry Ford, John Burroughs, and Edward Kingsford. Now, for those of you that don't know, the waste that is generally produced when logging a specific area is slag, sawdust, and of course, the stumps that you leave behind. And to make that land usable again, you'll have to remove each one of those stumps. And you're also left with a great deal of waste wood that you can't really use in any normal manufacturing process. Also, on this particular trip, they were having a great deal of trouble finding scraps of wood and cooking fuel in order to get the food that they wanted prepared. It really kind of seemed that there were a number of happy accidents that happened on this trip that really sort of culminated into coming up with some sort of a solution for these two problems. Henry Ford went back to work the following week and started into the process of trying to come up with some sort of a physical solution. The solution was to take scrap pieces of sawdust and wood from his mill and bind them together in small little chunks using tar and cornstarch. Before long, Henry had a workable prototype that he named the briquette. It wasn't long after that before Henry secured the plot of land that he wanted in the Iron Mountains. It was just a matter of setting up a mill and then also coming up with some sort of a facility to make the briquettes. He placed that facility just next door to the mill in the Iron Mountains. Ford had successfully done it. He had found a way to not only clear and get as much wood as he possibly could, but to also take the waste and turn it into a brand new product. Henry branded this new division of Ford Motor Company the Ford Charcoal Briquette Company. Henry first marketed the product by putting it into a picnic set. He would then market it with the link between owning an automobile and experiencing the great outdoors. Obviously, the product took off like wildfire. Pun intended. In late 1920, over 3,000 people were employed at both the mill and the briquette company. By December 29, 1923, the charter for the newly formed village of Kingsford was approved. In 1925, the number of people employed actually supported an expansion into Dickson County, and the entire project peaked with a top employment record of over 7,500 people. So you're probably thinking, if the company is called the Ford Charcoal Briquette Company, why exactly do we now know it only as Kingsford? As you may or may not know, Henry Ford passed away in 1947. He was succeeded by his grandson, Henry Ford II. Of course, the designs for Ford motor cars and trucks was slowly changing, and the need for wood in order to produce those cars was slowly dwindling out, and that meant that the mill and the briquette company were starting to lose their purpose. It was decided in 1951 that Ford Motor Company would put the briquette company up for sale. It was decided that rather than source new materials in order to make briquettes, that Ford Motor Company would just sell off the Ford Charcoal Briquette division. The sale was made official in 1951, and of course the new owners could no longer call the brand Ford Charcoal Briquette Company. They needed to come up with new branding in order to keep the company moving forward. They decided to honor the person that helped start Kingsford in the very first place. So they named it after Edward G. Kingsford. I hope you enjoyed this little piece of automotive history. If you're interested in other pieces of Ford history, please check out the other videos in my channel. Also, if you happen to own a pre-1954 Ford and are looking for a little bit of assistance, please check us out at myflatheadford.com. Also, if there's any piece of automotive history prior to 1953 that you'd be interested in hearing, please let me know in the comments. I'll see you next week for another piece of automotive history.